Good day everyone, Criminals here with another look at Star Citizen. Since the new Alpha 2.6 version went live directly before Christmas and I had a little bit of time playing it, I figured I'd give you a little bit of an overview of this new build as well as provide some feedback on it. Now this video will focus heavily on Star Marine as well as Arena Commander, the dogfight module, as this is where the bulk of the changes are with this new build, with Star Marine's live release as well as a lot of changes to the flight mechanics of the ships in Star Citizen. The next big version, 3.0, is supposed to be the big Persistence Universe upgrade, including some much needed network improvements for the baby PU, and we will take a closer look at the PU then. Still, there are a few smaller upgrades to the PU in 2.6 as well, I will take a quick look at. The first-person shooter and flight mechanics in Star Marine and Arena Commander are of course in the PU as well, but they are easier to show off in the smaller AC and Star Marine arenas than in the bigger PU. Well, let's start things off with some more Star Marine, which is of course the big thing about this newest version of Star Citizen, the introduction of proper first-person shooter mechanics to Star Citizen and the Star Marine arena shooter you can access from the SimBot in your hangar to test them out more easily than having to go looking for a fight in the PU Star system. Just a week ago I made a video showcasing Star Marine on the BTU test server in an early look and explained what it is there, so I won't go over all of this again, but we now have a newer version of this module on the live server and I got some more playing time in, so a few updates and extra thoughts on it are in order. First off, in the BTU version I showed last week, we still had a lot of micro lags and stutters, which dampened the flow of the game a bit. Thankfully, this has been fixed and the game runs pretty smoothly now. It is of course still an alpha, so it is not perfectly optimized, but for me at least it runs well now. And despite some bugs you still have, like occasionally falling through the floor or weapon malfunctions, I enjoy playing Star Marine quite a bit. I like the gunplay as well as the relatively high time to kill. I know not everybody does. After all, if longer or shorter TTKs in a shooter are better is something that is often argued about in heated discussions. In the end, in my opinion, something like this is about personal taste, for one, and how well it fits the scenario. For me personally, while I like both approaches if it fits the scenario, nobody wants to see high TTKs in armor for example, I prefer a higher TTK in general. The reason is that it gives me a feeling of being in a duel with my opponent, where the ability to aim and evade fire gives you the upper hand rather than who fires first. But again, this is down to personal preference and a lot of people have a different opinion on that. And of course, some will always prefer a lower TTK. However, thinking about it, I figure the Star Marine module and the Star Citizen PU can certainly provide both. In the current Star Marine module, we are all wearing full combat armor. It should not be that hard to make, for example, a map that is based on some back alley on, say, Area 18 instead of a space station, and have, for example, rivaling gangs fight it out instead of Marines. Then you can have the characters wear normal civilian clothing instead of sci-fi combat armor. That should reduce the TTK significantly. So I assume that further down the line, Star Marine could also provide options for lower TTKs than we have right now, and probably should, not just for those that prefer it, but also to test out combat without armor. In the PU, where clothing and armor is up to the player, this will happen as well after all, especially since it is planned that you won't be able to get into a tight pilot seat wearing bulky armor in the PU. Now in this first release of the Star Marine module, we only have two very basic game modes, one deathmatch mode and one domination mode, where you have to capture and hold terminals, similar to the flags in Battlefield Conquest mode, but at a smaller scale. Now those relatively simple game modes I noticed were off-putting to some players, expecting something more sophisticated. But of course the FPS mechanics also work in the much larger PU with its space station and ships as well. And the other way around, theoretically all the spaceships should work in Star Marine module as well already. CIG mentioned that they plan on introducing more complex game modes further down the line, which also include spaceships and possibly vehicles like the Ursa rover. A game mode called Capture the Idris was mentioned there, the Idris being a frigate-class capital ship. So there are certainly a lot of possibilities for the future of this module, but for now Star Marine focuses on testing out the basic shooter mechanics for Star Citizen, and that works best in a simpler environment where you can focus on that. I don't know how quickly those newer modes are planned though. Well, but speaking of spaceships, here we have a few more interesting changes in the 2.6 alpha. We got a relatively large change to the flight model of the spaceships, upgrades to the loadout screen, as well as a few new ships in the game, and also differences to the weapon damage. Let's talk about the biggest change first, the flight model. So far, fights in space in Star Citizen, in many of the builds we had, took place at a relatively large distance, where you could not really see your opponent a lot of the time. CIG wanted to get the fights a bit closer again, as it has been in some of the earlier builds of the game, and get some more close-in maneuvering in the fights. After all, Star Citizen is a distant descendant of games like Wing Commander or Freelancer with action-packed fights. So in order to do so, the top speed in the SCM mode, that is Space Combat Maneuvering mode, without the afterburner running, has been reduced quite a bit. They also played with lower acceleration on the test server, but the lower acceleration did not work out so well, so in the release version the acceleration is higher again than in some of the test builds. And this combination of lower SCM speed and still decent acceleration does indeed bring the fights closer together again, and the visuals in those close-in fights are pretty stunning in my opinion. Now, before 2.6, there were two modes you had to switch between while fighting: SCM, Space Combat Maneuvering, and Cruise Mode, with Cruise Mode allowing you higher top speeds but no maneuverability, a travel mode so to speak, while SCM was, as the name says, a maneuvering mode for combat. That system was a bit clunky to be honest, and in the 2.6 version has been replaced. Cruise mode is no longer in the game, however you can still reach cruise mode velocities, now simply by using the afterburner. That is a lot faster and more intuitive to use, and also means that the ships overall are not slower than they used to be. The top speed in the Space Combat Maneuvering mode without afterburner is lower, but you can always use the afterburner to go quickly up to the full old cruise mode speed. The boost is also still in the game. Boost increases your maneuverability, while afterburner increases your speed. Both use fuel now though, so you have to be careful not to overuse it, or your maneuverability and speed will be severely reduced. How much fuel is being used and when exactly is still something that needs balancing in my opinion, but the idea by itself of having this resource to look out for I think is a good one. It would also make external fuel tanks a more viable option for loadouts later down the line, and also make tanker ships more important in the PU. At the moment fuel is going down a little bit too fast though I think, especially with the long TTK in PvP. Overall, I like the 2.6 flight model as it is right now. Sure, there's always room for tweaks and improvements, but overall I think it feels nice now, with the acceleration back up a bit from the test version. I am not sure yet if it is my overall favorite among the flight model versions we had in Star Citizen so far, but I prefer it over 2.5, and I have fun flying, and that is the most important thing after all. What I'm not so sure about, however, is the weapon damage in space combat at the moment. The time to kill at the moment with guns is very long. Well, not so much versus NPCs, since they still can't fly versus them and don't have that much hit points, but taking a player ship down with guns and cannons now takes very long in my opinion. Now, I have not played a lot of Star Citizen the last year because of its early alpha status, so I'm certainly no expert and not that good, but still, even considering that, I feel that the time to kill with guns in spaceships is a bit too high, even though I like the high TTK in the first-person shooter part. Especially considering that most of the ships in Arena Commander are small single-seat fighters. I think that makes balancing a bit more difficult, because the more damage ships can take, the bigger of a difference heavier armament will make. And I think that gives heavier brawlers at the moment a larger advantage than they should have versus smaller opponents most of the time. Another big problem are missiles at the moment. The missile damage is still pretty high. That leads to missile damage being nowhere near in line with the damage that the guns do, and that leads to them being, in my opinion, simply way too strong. Aiming the guns in Star Citizen, especially fixed one, takes some skill. Missiles are in comparison super simple to use. They seem to have no engagement envelope or anything to keep in mind to properly use them, so you can lock a bunch of them on an opponent that is distracted with somebody else and shoot a whole salvo at short range into his side that takes the ship out with little chance to react. Having such a easy-to-use weapon to do so much damage is always a source of frustration in any game, and Star Citizen, especially with the gun damage in comparison being so low, that is a problem. Having said that, balancing guided missiles in a game is always difficult, and many have struggled with getting it right. Well, here are a few ideas on how to improve on that. Well, first of all, one of the problems we have currently in Star Citizen with missiles is that you can easily use missiles of a different type at the same time, while you on the other hand have to switch between different types of countermeasures. So you can just mix radar and IR guided missiles on your rails, lock all of them at the same target and fire at close range. Now it's gonna be very hard for the target to use both countermeasures that are necessary to defeat them. Here we finally need to be able to select which missiles we want to shoot, but at the same time not be able to just use every type we have at the same time. But there's a bigger problem with guided missiles in a game like Star Citizen, and that is their inherent all-or-nothing nature. The missile either hits and does massive damage, or misses and does nothing at all. This is very hard to balance and make fun in a game like Star Citizen. For example, my Gladius can carry a maximum of 4 size 3 missiles. Size 3 are pretty big for a fighter that size, and in the PU one would assume would also be expensive. The way it currently is, I can do massive damage with them when they hit. That leads to a situation where if I lock them on a target and they all hit, the fight is pretty much decided without needing much skill from my side, frustrating for the opponent. On the other hand, if they miss, which can also happen, nothing at all happens and I spend all my ordnance for no return at all, which is frustrating for me. So you see, there's a lot of potential for such weapons to be a source of frustration, because it's all or nothing. That is going to be especially a big problem when we get ships that are dedicated missile boats in the game, and we have to balance those, like the Freelancer Miss. You have to find a way to make a ship like this useful, but not frustrating for everybody else. And that is why I would try to get rid of this all-or-nothing nature of missiles if possible. Now, one way this could be done is by reducing the maximum damage missiles can do, but as a trade-off give them an increased explosion radius in which they can do damage even if they miss, and more of an proximity fuse to go with it, with damage of course getting lower with the distance of the target to the missile's explosion. This way you would not have the crippling maximum damage you can get now, but on the other hand also reduce instances where large missiles miss completely and do nothing at all. Countermeasures in this case would help make the missile explode further away, but 100% misses would be less often. That would also help with scaling damage to ship size naturally. Larger ships are more likely to take a closer hit with more damage, while fast and nimble targets are more likely to be further away from the center of the explosion and take less damage most of the time, and not just insta-explode to a salvo of missiles, without making missiles completely useless against them because they never hit at all. The idea for that is, as some might have guessed, based on EVE Online missiles. EVE, in its first years after release, had a few very large changes to its missiles as well, in order to deal with this very problem. When EVE came out, missiles were also all or nothing, though they had splash damage as well. Anyway, back then if a missile hit a target it would do its full damage, minus resistances, no matter the size of the target. Frigates could be destroyed with 1 or 2 hits from a cruise missile. On the other hand, you could outrun the missiles completely and take no damage at all. You could even drag missiles that were chasing you into other ships, which was fun, but in the end the whole thing was a nightmare to balance. So in the end they replaced it with a system where missiles were faster and more likely to hit the target. However, depending on the size and speed of the target, the damage of the missile would be different. The idea being that it was assumed that a faster target would be further away from the center of the explosion, and a smaller one would not take the full brunt of the explosion. Of course, in an old school MMO like EVE those were just numbers, but the basic idea of getting rid of an all-or-nothing system is the same. That is just one suggestion to balance missiles better, but whatever they end up doing, I hope they manage to get the balance with missiles right, since I really like playing around with different missile setups in the new loadout screen we have in the 2.6 alpha. With the new loadout screen you finally have a comfortable tool to change your ship's setup, either clicking at the 3D representation of the ship or clicking at the slot on the side, and especially the missiles give you quite a bit of customization options now. The way this works now is, if your ship has say a size 3 missile hardpoint, you can either put a single size 3 missile rail on it, or a twin rail for 2 smaller size 2 missiles, or a quad rail for 4 even smaller size 1 missiles, and so on. You can also mix what you bring on such a quad rail, for example, so there is a very large amount of possibility there for different loadouts. which I like a lot. I like to tinker with loadouts and what works best. We just need some improvements on how the missiles work so that they are balanced and that you can properly switch between missile types. Well, that was a bit of an overview and some feedback on Star Marine and the flight model and damage model changes in the Alpha 2.6 version. There are some additions to the baby PU as well, a few extra locations to visit, a new mission, and the Grimhex Outlaw base in the yellow asteroid belt has gotten a new bar, which looks like the one you may have seen in the 3.0 trailer presentation from Gamescom. We also got new ships, the Drake Herald Inforunner for example, which is a high-speed ship for communication, since there is no real faster-than-light travel communication between star systems in the Star Citizen lore. So information needs to be delivered via ship between star systems. This is supposed to play a role later in the persistent universe. When you, for example, manage to intercept such an Inforunner, you may be able to prevent the authorities from learning about a crime you may have committed further out in the universe. But we will see how this will work out in the end. And then there's also the Drake Caterpillar, a large multi-role transport ship, and a few variations of existing ships. Now, 2.6 also changed the engine Star Citizen's own Star engine is based on, from CryEngine to Amazon's Lumberyard, which is a CryEngine derivative like the Star engine. That doesn't really make a big difference right now, but later in the development of the game it will, since Lumberyard's version of the CryEngine is focused on multiplayer and cloud computing, while the original CryEngine is not. That should make it easier later in the game to provide relatively low latency for players around the globe. The announcement of this switch was a surprise, but again does not really make a difference yet. Overall, most of the new stuff in the Alpha 2.6 version focuses on Star Marine and the flight model changes. The next big release, 3.0, is the one that is supposed to be about the persistent universe, with much improved netcode for the PU and planets to visit, and Lumberyard may already help with that. We will see. So, that was a bit of an overview and some feedback on Star Citizen Alpha 2.6. I really like playing Star Marine. The PU itself is still a bit choppy though, with the current netcode still not really being able to handle the persistent universe. This is supposed to be addressed in the 3.0 version of the game, and if that is true, I'm really looking forward to it. With the first-person shooter elements and the new flight model, I think the persistent universe will be a lot of fun when it finally gets the netcode to run it all properly. Well, and this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was informative, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.